You've got $100,000. Maybe it's sitting in a savings account. Maybe you just inherited it or sold something or spent years grinding to stack it up. Doesn't matter how you got it. What matters is what happens next. Because $100,000 is a serious amount of money. In Australia right now, with the right strategy, it can become 1 million. The only real question is how fast. And for most Australians, getting to 100,000 in cash is already a milestone. The average full-time salary in this country just crossed $106,000 before tax. But after tax, after rent or mortgage, after groceries, after the electricity bill that seems to go up every quarter, after everything, most people are lucky to save 15 to 20,000 a year. That means $100,000 represents roughly 5 to 7 years of disciplined saving for an average earner. It's not pocket money, it's years of your life compressed into a number. And what you do with that number from here determines whether those years of sacrifice actually lead somewhere. The whole game comes down to compound interest. Your money earns a return, and then that return earns a return, and then that return earns its own return. It starts slow, almost frustratingly slow, but it builds. And at a certain point, the growth becomes so aggressive that your money starts doing things that feel like they shouldn't be possible. There's a shortcut to understand the speed. It's called the rule of 72. You take 72 and divide it by your annual return. That gives you the number of years it takes to double your money. At 10%, that's 7.2 years to double. So 100,000 becomes 200,000 in about 7 years. Then 200 becomes 400 in another 7. Then 400 becomes 800. And shortly after that, you've crossed a million. The first doubling is where most people lose faith. 7 years go by and all you've done is add another 100,000. It doesn't feel life-changing. It doesn't feel like you're on your way to 1 million. But that's the trap. Because during the second doubling, you're not growing 100,000 anymore. You're growing 200,000. The returns are literally twice as large. And during the third doubling, they're 4 times larger than they were at the start. By the time you're compounding on 400 or 500,000, a single good year in the market can add $50,000 or $60,000 to your portfolio. Now let's put real numbers behind this, using what's actually available to Australians in April 2026. Your first option is a high interest savings account. The best rates right now sit around 5.50 to 5.65%. Sounds reasonable, but at 5.5%, your 100,000 takes roughly 44 years to hit 1 million. And that's before you factor in inflation, which is running at 3.7% as of February 2026. Your real return after inflation is barely 1.8%. So after 44 years of waiting, that 1 million buys you what roughly 350,000 buys you today. And here's the part that stings. Over those 44 years, you didn't just lose time. You lost the opportunity to compound at a higher rate for every single one of those years. A savings account doesn't just get you there slowly, it actively holds you back from what your money could have been doing somewhere else. Every year, your 100,000 sits at 5.5% instead of 10%. The gap between where you are and where you could have been gets wider. After just 10 years, the difference between 5.5% and 10% on 100,000 is roughly $95,000. That's almost another 100,000 you left on the table in a single decade. Your second option is the Australian share market. The ASX 200 has averaged around 9 to 10% per year over the past decade with dividends reinvested. Let's stay conservative and call it 9.5%. At 9.5%, your 100,000 reaches 1 million in about 25 years. No extra contributions, no complicated strategy, just a low-cost index fund like VAS or VDHG bought once and left completely alone. You've already slashed 19 years off the savings account timeline just by choosing a different vehicle. But you're not going to just sit there contributing nothing for 25 years. So let's see what happens when you add fuel. If you invest that 100,000 and contribute $500 a month, at 9.5% you hit 1 million in roughly 18 years. $500 a month is Uber Eats, streaming services and coffees you don't remember ordering. Redirected into an index fund, it cuts nearly a decade off the clock. Bump that to $1,000 a month at 10% average returns, and you're at 1 million in about 15 years. Now let's talk about going global. The iShares S&P 500 ETF on the ASX IVV has delivered about 15.2% annualized over the past 10 years. Those numbers include a monster run in US tech, so let's not assume that continues forever. But even at a more conservative 12%, $100,000 reaches 1 million in about 20 years with zero contributions. Add 1,000 a month at that same 12%, and the timeline drops to around 14 years. Push your contributions to 1,500 a month, and you're looking at roughly 12 and a half years. At 2,000 a month with 12% returns, it's closer to 12 years flat. And when you get there, 1 million in investable assets changes your life in ways that aren't just theoretical. At a conservative 4% withdrawal rate, 1 million generates $40,000 a year in passive income without ever touching the principal. That's almost $770 a week landing in your account while you sleep. Combine that with even a modest income or a partial pension, and you've got genuine financial freedom. Not flashy, not Lamborghinis, but the kind of freedom where you work because you want to, not because you have to. Where you take 3 months off and nothing falls apart. Where a surprise bill doesn't send you into a spiral. And once you've crossed 1 million, something else happens that almost nobody talks about. The second million comes drastically faster than the first. At 10% returns on 1 million, your money is generating $100,000 a year in growth alone. The game doesn't slow down after a million, it accelerates. And that's why speed matters so much in the early years. Every year you shave off the journey to 1 million is a year you gain on the far more powerful compounding that happens after it. Think about what that means. Same $100,000. But the difference between parking it in a savings account and actively investing it with consistent monthly contributions is more than 30 years. 3 decades, an entire generation of time, gone or gained depending on what you decide to do. And this is where most people make the critical mistake. They don't start. They look at the market and think it's too complicated. They hear about a crash on the news and convince themselves they need to wait for the perfect moment. They tell themselves they'll figure it out next year. But every single year you delay has a real cost, and it's not the cost most people think. It's not just one lost year of returns. It's one lost year of compounding on every single year that follows. The mechanics of actually doing this are simple. You open a brokerage account. You pick a low-cost index ETF. VAS gives you the top 300 Australian companies for 0.07% a year in fees. VGS gives you over 1,400 international companies across 22 developed countries for 0.18%. You set up a recurring investment so money moves automatically every month. And then you do nothing. You don't touch it when the market drops. You don't get clever and try to time a dip. You don't sell because someone on social media told you a recession is coming. You just let time and compounding do what they've been doing for over 100 years of market history. That's the real answer. $100,000 can become 1 million in as few as 12 years or as many as 44. The speed depends on 2 things: where you put the money and how much you keep adding. If you got something out of this, subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.